This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
I'm very delighted to have Mark Pendleton speaking to us on Tokyo. Mark is a lecturer in East Asian Studies, a social and cultural historian at Sheffield University, with a range of interests on 20th century Japan and Tokyo particularly, but also the history of transnational social movements, the history of sexuality and gender, and also the relationship between history and memory, if I remember correctly. I met Mark as part of a project, an HRC-funded project on reconfiguring ruins, and I've seen several of his talks, and it only makes sense for us to invite him to give us a perspective on different metropolises, not just London or European metropolises, but also metropolises, in this case from East Asia. So tonight Mark is going to speak to the title, The City as Phoenix, Ruination and Recovery in 20th Century Japan.
Thanks, Carlos, and thanks for having me. So, variations of the Phoenix are common in a range of literary and cultural traditions. And in the context of East Asia, the bird is most commonly associated with the Ho in Japanese or the Fenghuang in Chinese, a mythological creature considered to be the supreme bird and encompassing various attributes, primarily of high virtue and grace, and of the fusion of yin and yang. And we can see a few examples here where the Ho appears across the region. This is a drawing from the 17th century from a Dutch painter, Song Dynasty vase. You can see the phoenix head is the shape of there, and even in the seal of the President of the Republic of Korea, there are representations of the phoenix. So the phoenix has a kind of a cross-regional resonance, I guess. And in the context of Japan, the phoenix is also found in a range of artistic representations. But I'm not primarily an art historian, and this is not an art history seminar. So for my purposes today, I want to instead briefly introduce you to an example from much more contemporary history, in which a prominent popular artist uses the mythology of the phoenix as a commentary on the urban landscape of the post-war Japanese city. And from there I want to walk you through some preliminary thoughts that I've had around how we might think of this representation in the context of other models of historical time and temporality, including Benjamin's Angelus Novus from the Thesis on the Philosophy of History, linear progress narratives such as modernization theory in the context of Japan, contemporary ruins scholarship, and post-war critical writing about Tokyo. And this is really an early attempt at synthesizing a fairly large body of material I'm working with at the moment, so I really welcome questions and comments, and we can see where it goes from there. Okay, so to start with the phoenix from the seminar title, one of the most well-known examples of its deployment in recent Japanese cultural context is in the manga series Hinotori, literally meaning firebird, by possibly the most famous manga artist of all time, Tezuka Osamu. Often considered his masterwork, the Hinotori was a 12-volume series of interrelated stories written between 1967 and 1988. And this is a period which coincides with the peak of Japan's post-war economic prosperity. Tezuka himself died in 1989, the same year as the wartime emperor Showa died, and the year often marked as the beginning of the bursting of that post-war economic bubble. And the stories in Tezuka's, just to give you a sense, it's also kind of rolled out into a whole range of other kinds of popular forms, including an animated movie, which was circulated internationally, and a game as well. And stories in Tezuka's series cross centuries from the prehistoric to the imagined future, and draw in a range of historical and mythological figures common in Japanese narrative, including the shaman queen Himiko. And central to all these stories is the figure of the firebird. I'm just going to give you a few just some things to look at to give you a sense of the kind of the temporal scope of the series. So what Tezuka does though is he fuses these kind of East Asian imageries of the Ho, which I kind of showed you briefly before, with Western mythology around phoenixes. His firebird emerges from ashes in an ongoing cycle of reincarnation, and its blood in the narrative is the key to eternal life, which many of the characters are seeking to exploit. But in contrast to traditionally Buddhist notions of reincarnation common across East Asia, in Tezuka's world, this process of reincarnation is not simple. While the blood of the firebird is meant to provide eternal life, in the story it's unclear if eternal life is in itself worthy of being strived for. It often functions instead as an unattainable fantasy or even a cursed process. The characters are often destroyed by that desire for eternal life and profit. So, and alongside the firebird, throughout the manga are various images of shifting forms of organized collective life, from early villages susceptible to brutal destruction at the hands of enemies to futuristic cityscapes, which are perhaps more familiar to those who might know Tezuka's works other works such as the internationally successful Astro Boy cartoons, which is circulated a lot more broadly. So in his Hinotori, written at the time of these teleological narratives of modernization of permanent economic growth that were common in Japan, there's a decidedly negative understanding of historical time. The city and its inhabitants are constantly at risk of destruction, and this ruinous process leads often to a re-emergence, but albeit in a reduced form. So I'm going to come back to how others have imagined the post-war city in the bulk of my talk, but before I do so, I wanted to just give you some kind of broader context to what I'm doing in this project. So in Walter Benjamin's classic thesis on the philosophy of history, he describes the Paul Klee painting Angelus Novus, in which an angel is both moving away from something while pointedly looking at it. And this tension between the need to view the ruined past and the perpetual forward propulsion provides a particular take on history. Benjamin argues that this angel of history views the past as a single catastrophe that keeps piling wreckage upon wreckage and hurls it in front of his feet. And for Benjamin, the angel would like to make whole what has been smashed, but is instead continually propelled forward, leaving behind an ever-expanding mountain of debris. And this viewpoint of history is both progressive and at the same time built on the ruins of the past, a kind of ever-perpetual forward motion, is one that continues to shadow the discipline of history despite massive transformations in historiography. And as I mentioned briefly earlier, Japanese history was also for a long time shadowed by debates over another kind of progress narrative, modernization theory, which sought to kind of position Japan as on one side either marching unidirectionally towards a more liberal and progressive future, or by critics the very opposite. And while those debates from the 70s and 80s have largely subsided, I think in the post-bubble collapse, and particularly after the triple disaster of March 2011, you can see them return, at least in popular prominence, both in narratives of normalization deployed by the Abe government, which sees a particular empowered form of the modern state as the endpoint of historical evolution, and in concerns about reversion to a pre-liberal militarized past, as expressed by critics. So both of them are kind of working within this same kind of notion of kind of ruinous past and perpetual motion. So what my broader project is doing, I'm calling it at the moment a history of ruins or history in ruins, is seeking to kind of question these narratives of history through revisiting these earlier debates that I touched on, alongside the kind of boom in Euro-American scholarship on ruins and ruination over the last decade or so, and through several specific ruin sites. So it's a kind of, I guess, a conceptual process that's kind of made real through particular locations in Japan. And one of the key sites that I'm using, other than Tokyo, which will be the main focus of my talk today, is the island of Hashima, or Gunkanjima, known as Battleship Island, off the southwest coast of Japan. It's perhaps most famous for those of you who are Bond fans as the location for Javier Bardem's villain's lair in the Bond film Skyfall from 2012. But it was actually the site of an undersea coal mine operated by Mitsubishi between the late 19th century and 1974, and it was left abandoned for several decades afterwards before becoming now a popular tourist attraction and UNESCO World Heritage Site. So what I'm trying to do in this project, I guess, is thinking about how ruination can be understood as a process that is mutually destructive and productive, and that in these moments of destruction there exists a kind of open-ended rather than a foreclosed process in which a myriad of potential futures are revealed, tested, and in some cases abandoned. And so excavating these kind of particular moments of ruination kind of, I suggest, allows us a process to look back at historically failed future visions and to think of the contemporary moment in Japan not as either perfectly positive and progressive, nor as simply reactionary and backward-looking. When things fail, alternative future visions open up. And this relates to the work of theorists like Anne Laura Stoller, who have suggested that ruins are sites that condense alternative senses of history, and that ruination is an ongoing corrosive process that weighs on the future. So the starting point for this broader project is the kind of growth in interest in ruins in Japan over the last couple of decades, known as a Haikyo or ruins boom. And this emerges from the 90s onwards, and it's permeated popular culture, artistic representation, and tourist practice, and led to some transformations in Japanese ideas of architectural conservation and heritage. And while the boom is well documented in the popular press, it's not really come in for as much academic analysis, and certainly I don't think it's been adequately historicized. And this is in contrast with the European ruin and lust of the 18th and 19th century and its re-emergence and reformulation in the early 21st century. Before we move on, though, it's worth acknowledging, Carlos already did this, that this project really does emerge from conversations I've had with several people over a number of years, including through the Reconfiguring Ruins project that Carlos was also involved in. And in this project, we were looking to do justice to ruins, is the way we talked about it. So thinking about kind of ruins in their complexity, and then do that through a focus on materialities, processes, and mediations of ruins. So kind of that three-pronged approach. And the year before that, I had a specific project that I was working on with some geographers, performance studies people, and earth scientists, looking at Hashima in particular, that island that I spoke about briefly. This really does emerge from those those two projects. So my interest in the ruin really emerges from two particular points. Firstly, I think that, as I've already suggested, that the idea of the ruin continues to function through frameworks that are oriented to classical and romantic traditions of Western Europe, and these have been read as universal. And my contention is that the ruin in 20th century Japanese cultural history, at least, is not a simplistic borrowing of European ideas, but as with many modern and contemporary phenomena in Japan, there's a much more interesting process of adoption and adaptation that's taking place within existing cultural patterns and historical trajectories. And in Japan, as hopefully we'll see a bit more as we go along, the ruin is important both because it resonates with Western modernity, but also because of specific phenomena experienced in Japan. And so my second point really is that ruination is a relatively underexplored but central concept to the Japanese project of modernization. Excuse me. And this project is also never entirely separate from, but not exactly co-equal with Western modernity, as many people have pointed out. So the broader project really explores several ruinous moments in 20th century Japan, when the immediate past is destroyed and something new begins. At each of these junctures, I tease out specific literary, intellectual, and cultural representations of ruination, as they relate both to the urban metropolis, as represented by Tokyo, and to more peripheral sites such as the island of Hashima. Excuse me. So in the bulk of my talk today, I'm going to focus on the city, because seeing we're here at Urban History seminar, and particularly the wartime destruction of Tokyo, and the subsequent emergence of the post-war economic and social mythologies of eternal growth and permanent peace, alongside critical commentaries on this post-ruination recovery process. And I'm going to focus on a particular construction of how historical time is conceptualized and engaged with in the aftermath of ruination. So before I kind of narrow in on one particular kind of element of that project, I want to just kind of skate you through kind of why I think ruination is important as a much larger kind of framing device across the 20th century. And I do that in this project through 5 kind of key sites or time periods. And the first is the very literal ruination of the 1923 Tokyo earthquake, which coincided with the tail end of the brief flowering of the pre-war Taisho democracy and the ramping up of the Japanese Empire. So on September 1st, 1923, Tokyo was nearly flattened by a massive earthquake and a subsequent fire that resulted in the deaths of some 120,000 people and left about 2 million people homeless. And this is a map of the disaster. The kind of hatched area in this giant kind of large red area was completely destroyed by the Tokyo fires in the aftermath of the earthquake. The larger red kind of locations are the sites where evacuees, refugees were gathered around the edges of the city. In fact, some of the sites were where the largest loss of life was experienced because they were actually not sufficiently away from the fires. We're talking about huge destruction, one of the largest. And just to give you a sense of the impact it had on Tokyo's population, these are the population of Tokyo pre and post the earthquake in comparison to other major cities at the time. So this is Tokyo before the earthquake here, just smaller than Chicago, Paris and so on. And afterwards it's dropped below Moscow, Leningrad, and many other kinds of small cities. So you can see just the significance it had on the population of the city. And in response, the relatively recently industrialized Empire of Japan embarked on a massive reconstruction project, and this disaster also caused internal conflict. With some conservatives blaming the disaster on divine retribution for the perceived moral decadence of the Taisho period. Some people also spread rumours that Korean nationals were poisoning wells in the aftermath, which led to vigilante attacks against ethnic Koreans. At least several hundred and possibly several thousand were killed. Despite the scale of the disaster and the way in which it fuses material and social ruination, it remains relatively unknown outside of Japan. Although this is changing in recent years with a series of recent publications in English about the quake and its aftermath, focusing particularly on its representation in cultural forms, visual culture and literary culture. But just to give you one example of the way this permeates a whole range of cultural forms, this is a tanka poem from the poet and playwright Yoshii Isamu, who lived from 1886 to 1960. Okay, so as I said, the project looks is about kind of putting these urban centres alongside these much more peripheral sites. So at the same time the earthquake is happening in Tokyo, down in Hashima or Gunkanjima, a process of massive expansion of the island has been taking place, of reclaiming the island from the ocean. So you can see here, before 1893, it's very small, the dark blue area in the middle. By the time we get to, just a few years after the earthquake, it's a completely transformed urban landscape. You can see the scale kind of increasing over time there. And this is the kind of transformation of the island from a fairly natural looking kind of topography to something that's completely shrouded by concrete development. Within a couple of years of 23, Gunkanjima also began to play host to labourers that were forcibly transported from the colonies of Korea and later China to work in the mines as well. So by 1944, Hashima had over 1,300 Korean workers, about 25% of the workforce working there. And we have records of at least 120 deaths on the island. Bronchial pneumonia and suffocation were the most common recorded deaths of Koreans. And there's a very rich oral history kind of process that's taken place by activist groups to kind of uncover these stories that attest to the kind of processes of physical ruination of bodies of these workers, a very tangible effect of colonization that carries through to the very near present. And Stoller, again, has pointed to histories such as these to argue that part of our present task is not to suggest that the contemporary world can be accounted for by colonial histories alone. It's rather to understand how these histories yield new damages and renewed disparities. And so for her, ruination is an active ongoing process, and with ruin understood as a violent verb that unites apparently disparate moments, places and objects. So there's just a couple more quotes from there. So the second, I don't think we need to dwell on that too much. The second moment I'm going to come back to in more detail in the kind of last third of the talk is kind of is Tokyo in the aftermath of 1945. When, like most major cities, Tokyo was almost completely flattened into burnt-out ruins, which came to be known as the Yakiato or the Yakinohara, from which, metaphorically, the post-war society was reborn. And on Hashima as well, because it's near Nagasaki, they experienced the fallout from the second atomic bombing of the island. And in the aftermath, forced labourers, this is again from one of the oral history narratives, were transported to the mainland to work on recovery projects and were themselves exposed to the fallout. And the Nagasaki Peace Park itself was actually built on the ruins of the Urakami prison, in which 134 people died, including about 45 non-Japanese nationals as well. Excuse me, I've got a very dry throat for some reason today. All right, hopefully we'll get on. I'll snap out of it. Okay.
Should you open the windows? Or?
It's okay. I think I'll just power through my water, and if I have to cough my way through it, then that's how it is. I apologise. So the third moment that I'm kind of looking at is kind of the defeat of broad-based progressive politics in the 1960s and the slow slide into reascendant nationalism and capitalism. And to explore this moment, I'm working with colleagues in Tokyo on archival materials from student and other radical movements of the 1960s, who imagined alternatives to the alienation of the urban city. And I guess the moment I'm using as a kind of catalyst for this thought process is the 2-day battle over the occupied 9-story Yasuda Auditorium at Tokyo University. And this was named after the Yasuda Family Corporation, which funded its original construction in the 1920s. The battle involved smashed windows, Molotov cocktails, water cannon, and then the building was ruined, obviously. And I guess I get a sense, my argument is that in the ruin of this building, you kind of get a sense of the collapse of that kind of 1960s imaginary of a different kind of form of Japan. The tower itself remained shuttered for about 20 years and only reopened in the early 1990s after, again, getting the corporate largesse of the Yasuda family. And alongside this, I guess by the 1960s, Hashima is in decline. Production has been brought to a halt by the death of a worker. And but despite this, the oral histories of people who were living on the island at the time attest to a kind of an almost fantastic idea of idyllic community life and post-war cultural artifacts, such as film and television, which are meant to kind of stand in for the Japanese nation as a whole. In January 1974, the island's owners announced the mine's closure, and the island was fully abandoned by April, and many of the material objects associated with the mine and island life were left behind, only to be uncovered decades later by ruins enthusiasts as weathered remnants of the past. Okay, so the fourth moment is the post-bubble collapse of the post-war economy, which I've already touched on briefly. And in the 1990s, 1995 in particular, you start to get a kind of the re-emergence of this idea that Japan is going through a process of destruction. This is the prominent youth activist Amamiya Karin, who describes her generation as living on the burnt-out ruins of the bubble's collapse, the same kinds of language that were being used in the 1940s. And it's also unsurprising, I suggest, that this coincides with the emergence of that ruins boom, which I touched on at the beginning, with it, which is kind of laden with pathos and nostalgia, an obsessive focus on evacuated landscapes of a prosperous time that is no more. An interesting example of this is the work of contemporary visual artist Motoda Hisaharu, who takes this motif of ruination to its kind of logical end by imagining future dystopic landscapes of Japanese and other iconic sites. Apologies. Hashimoto itself comes to stand in for this process through a kind of process of almost becoming the Haikyo ruin site par excellence, and through photographers and other kind of visitors coming to the island and documenting the kind of ruined detritus of that post-war economic bubble. You can see, just click through those fairly quickly. This is from a collection by a guy called Kobayashi Shinichiro. You can see the kinds of objects of post-war, presumably universal kind of experiences of post-war cultural life. And then from towards the end of that, you start to get these kind of publications of tourist guides. Hashimoto becomes a kind of one of the key sites of this kind of the boom in Haikyo tourism, and even appears in children's picture books. So. And the final, I guess, moment in that kind of 5 year, across the kind of long 20th century, I guess, is the triple disaster of 11th of March 2011. When the spectre of nuclear radiation kind of returns to public eye alongside the very real destruction of coastal towns. Alright, so obviously I don't have time to discuss all of this today, but what I hope you get a sense of, as I've skated through this quite quickly, is that each of these moments of ruination, in each of these moments there's a kind of, there are opportunities to review the contemporary horizons of politics and culture and potentially move in different directions. So it's not historical progress in a purely linear sense, but it's one in which kind of future ideas of the future kind of proliferate. You have multiple kind of things happening at the same time. So what I want to focus on in the remainder of my time today is some material that I've been working through over the last few months while I was on research leave at Nichibunken, the International Research Center in Kyoto. And specifically I've been reading the literary and critical works of the post-war novelist Hino Keizo, who's, again, someone who's not really that well known outside of Japan. He was a prominent literary figure from the 1950s, when as a student at Tokyo University, he was central in the establishment of several literary publications, up until his death about a decade ago. And in particular, I want to focus on, excuse me, on two particular sets of Hino's work. The 1985 novel, Yumi no Shima, or Isle of Dreams, which won the Geijutsu Zensho Prize and was also recently published in English translation many years later. And two much earlier essays he wrote in the 1950s. One was called Yakeato ni tsuite, or On the Burnt-Out Ruins of the Post-War, from 1955, and Haikyo, or Ruins Theory, from 1959. So does anybody have a tissue? It kind of seems to be having a bit of a... Sorry to be a...
I think it's probably a good idea if we open the window.
Can I open it?
Yeah.
Oh, thank you so much. Thanks, guys.
No worries.
Apologies.
No, it's okay. It is a bit stuffy.
Yeah.
So.
All right.
But we probably need to get some fresh air in.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks, Matthew.
All right. So, as I said, so this kind of novel in the 1980s, and then in the 1950s there were a series of kind of critical texts he wrote around ruins. And when reading these together, I suggest that they indicate something about the possibility of using the ruined and reborn city as one means to rethink modern and contemporary Japanese history and the possibilities available in the present. Okay, so in a discussion of the work of the much more internationally famous Japanese novelist Murakami Haruki, Matthew Strecker notes that Yume no Shima, this novel, vied unsuccessfully with Murakami's hard-boiled Wonderland at the End of the World, which many people would be familiar with, for a major literary prize. Both books are set in Tokyo, a common choice for many authors writing in the period, for whom the city is, quote, presented as a facade of sanity, masking the turmoil and despair of the postmodern age that lurk beneath the surface. Isle of Dreams, Strecker argues, is particularly representative of this period, as it deals almost exclusively with the theme of the beautiful empty shell of Tokyo in the 1980s. And for Hino, this beautiful emptiness is most evident from the reclaimed lands in the bay, which now occupy over 95% of the shoreline. So you can get a sense, and this is the kind of a map of the ringing of Tokyo Bay with all the various reclaimed lands and developments that happened over the course of time. I'm not going to break it down, but you can see there's really very little of the original shoreline left in Tokyo. And in this novel, Hino's protagonist often describes these landscapes in loving terms. Here's a quote. He says, "This evening too, the sunset on the reclaimed land was beautiful, particularly here on Site 13, devoid of buildings, other than a row of level warehouses along the eastern bank. On the southern edge, where he had recently been, the lone ventilation tower of the seabed tunnel soared into the sky," etc., etc. The empty city is a key motif in Hino's work, but he's resistant to descriptions of his work as exclusively about the contemporary city. So for him, the emptiness is also about an historic landscape of ruination, and the simultaneous burying of this landscape in memory. He wrote in an interview, "From soon after Yume no Shima came out, whenever you opened any magazine to read about the book, you would just see the words city, city, city. But for me, one thing was much more clearly apparent, the ruins in the background." And what he's talking about here is the fire-bombed landscapes of 1945 Tokyo. And here's a map of the kind of areas that were fire-bombed. And from those who might remember the map a little bit earlier, I showed the kind of earthquake sites of a fairly comparable kind of scale. The city was destroyed in 1945. And this is a city that Hino returned to as a teenager after spending several years abroad in the outposts of the Japanese Empire. And for him, this return to the destroyed city is a formative memory trope in his descriptions of his writing and in the works themselves. He says, "I lived in Tokyo until I was 5, and then I moved to Korea. I knew pre-war Tokyo. After that time, I lived in Korea for 10 years and then graduated high school the year after the war. While I was in Korea, I was nostalgic for that Tokyo. I just thought, I want to go home to Tokyo, I want to go back. But when I finally returned, Tokyo wasn't there. It was simply a ruin. Tokyo had completely disappeared." And so for Hino, who was born in 1929, he's part of a generation of Japanese people who grew up with this experience of loss, their childhood memories supplanted by the destruction of much of the urban landscape of Japan. And these memories themselves were then further erased by post-war processes of reconstruction. And scholars have referred to this generation shaped by water feet as a yakeato serai, or a burnt-out ruins generation. For Roman Rosenbaum, this generation is marked by a lack of direct culpability due to its members' relatively young age during the war years. But they're also characterized by a sense of responsibility that arises from a recognition of the wartime activities of their parents and their experiences as victims of war. And Rosenbaum argues that victors' justice erases memory, but victims' justice leads to a much deeper, often artistic expression of self-interrogation. And for Isle of Dreams, and I think he knows more generally, that these are kind of an example of this generational self-interrogation of the past through fiction. A process that requires consideration of the legacies of war and empire, but also of what happened in the post-war. And for writers like Hino, post-war processes of ruination are as important as the war-ravaged yakiato themselves. Excuse me. So the radical transformation of Tokyo did not end, obviously, with the ruinous events of 1945, but continued in the decades after, as economic prosperity fueled a seemingly never-ending desire for expansion. Sorry, I don't know my body is not participating very well in this process, so I do apologise. I don't usually have various
Could be perhaps like
things coming out of my body.
allergy of some sort.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Anyway, I apologise. I will power through. So by the mid-1980s, when Hino was writing Yume no Shima, he'd witnessed really over 40 years of change in the city, cycles of destruction and renewal occurring alongside and often in contrast with this kind of post-war theological narrative of progress, centered on the myth of permanent growth. Speculative debt-fueled expansion precipitated the post-1989 collapse of the economy, but in 1985, when he was writing this, much of this was yet to come. In an economy that believed the only direction was forward, or in the case of construction, upwards into ever higher skyscrapers. And just to give you a sense of the landscapes that we're talking about in Hino's work, this is a view from Odaiba, one of the reclaimed islands in Tokyo Bay, looking back across some of the other kind of artificial constructions to the city itself. In Isle of Dreams, Hino's protagonist, Sakai Shozo, who himself works for a construction company, describes the city as characterized by the beauty of contemporary buildings, sharply geometrical in form, devoid of superfluous decor, adroitly bringing to the fore a texture that was both mineral and metallic. And alongside the beauty that Hino and Sakai found in the vertical materiality of the city comes a darker presence that is materialized on this horizon of the reclaimed islands in Tokyo Bay. And Isle of Dreams is set on the eponymous Yume no Shima, excuse me, which as both concept and reality is bound up with the history of modern Japan. So during the post-war period of rapid economic growth, the Tokyo Metropolitan government revived pre-war plans and began using landfill to create or expand on artificial islands as a temporary solution to Tokyo's massive waste problem. The initial site for then Tokyo Governor Minobe Ryokichi's Wara garbage was a pre-existing artificial island made by dredged sand in the 1930s, and used in the early post-war as a short-lived artificial beach, the so-called Isle of Dreams. Yume no Shima became an illegal dumping site, which you can see here by the 1960s, before Minobe's plan turned this into a more formal reality. And the solution of Yume no Shima was really only temporary in and of itself, and they ended up having to create a whole bunch more additional landfill sites in the bay from there on. Now, Yume no Shima in its contemporary manifestations is primarily a large park, including a greenhouse heated by burning garbage. It also houses the memorial to the victims of the Lucky Dragon incident of 1954, in which Japanese fishermen drifted into the fallout of a nuclear test in the Pacific, an incident that's been credited as a catalyst for the development of Japan's post-war anti-nuclear politics. The memorial is housed here as the boat, which went back into circulation as a fishing boat in the aftermath of the nuclear radiation, was actually found. That's it there on the in amongst the rubbish on the island, abandoned. So the siting of these post-war wastelands on the periphery of the metropolis is not arbitrary. Tokyo had by now largely oriented itself towards these kind of vertical horizons of expansion. For Ignacio Adriosola, the haunted landscape where Tokyo meets the bay indicates the paradoxical centrality of the periphery to modernity. And for Adriosola, he traces the creation of this kind of central position of the periphery to the emergence of architect Tange Kenzo's 1960s master plan, Tokyo Metropolis, which sought to circumvent the disorder of the city by colonizing the wasteland into an officially sanctioned order in liberty that rearticulated the center into an axial node. And this was linked to a particular historical reconstruction of the city as a capitalist utopia of urban hyperdensification. And now this was never realized, but I think what Adriosola is suggesting is that that this kind of was influential in kind of shaping the way in which people kind of conceptualize their relationship with these kind of peripheral sites. And while this emerged most notably in the 60s, like the story of Yume no Shima, it's itself linked to earlier imperial histories. And this is a quote from Adriosola. He says, while in the plan, Tange aspired to create in the bay a blank slate for Tokyo as megalopolis, the capitalist utopia of the future, its mysterious links to the pre-existing built environment speak of an unresolved relationship to the city and the nation's past and memory. This monumental gesture was the expression of the dream of growth, a dream that was the fruit not only of utopian capitalism, but also the repressed memory of empire. But Japan's ascendancy inevitably relied on a new form of colonial exploitation of the continent. So in Hino's vision of the peripheral landscape of Yume no Shima, you get a similar sense of this kind of centrality of kind of imperial memory and haunting ghostliness of the past, if you like, in the city. And Hino has termed the relationship these liminal geographical sites have with the city as a kind of Mobius strip. And this metaphor of the Mobius strip as intertwined, as simultaneously linear and circular, also connects his fictional narratives to social processes of memory making and future imaginations. Here's a quote. "The front all of a sudden becomes the back, and the back the front. In my Tokyo, if we're looking for negatives that become positives, start at the burnt-out ruins of the post-war. The city is an imminently destructible thing. This idea that everything in the universe is breakable or in a state of ruination is one example of a sense of the evanescence of life. In contemporary terms, this is often called the law of entropy. But on the other hand, grass soon grows on earth made from garbage, the artificial becomes the natural, and a new Tokyo is born." So as I said earlier, this kind of idea, Hino's thinking through of the ruins starts much earlier, in the 1950s. In one of those articles, he starts from Eric Maria Remarque's 1929 novel, All Quiet on the Western Front, by arguing that this book is to be neither an accusation or a confession. It will try simply to tell of a generation of men who were destroyed by war. And for Hino, like Remarque, he argues that war ruins both geographically and psychologically, and that's reflected for Hino in the landscape of the city. And Tokyo's ruinous past has a dual function in post-war history that's made visible through people's relationship to the past, according to Hino, and to the materiality of the landscape itself. Excuse me. It's a curious way to put it, but the yakeato, these burnt-out ruins, does not only have a negative sense of something no longer being the thing it once was, but also a positive sense of the true essence of that thing being revealed. Streets and houses and tree-lined avenues did not meaninglessly disappear. Steel and stone and cement and earth were actually made visible. Meaningful things that people found familiar disappeared, but were revealed in all their nakedness. And so when he comes back to this kind of theme in the 80s, he's able to explore this process through several key scenes, in which Tokyo's contemporaneous problems with overconsumption and ruinous waste are set alongside the spectres of the past. And one such scene takes place on the Harumi Wharf, which is itself created from landfill, where his protagonist witnesses a large number of young people entering a convention centre, where they set up zine tables and engage in cosplay. For Sakai, this space and its teenage inhabitants suggest to him something about the alienation of the transformed capitalist city, and the relationship between the periphery and the centre. He says, "There's something about these costumed boys and girls, roaming aimlessly, that clung to them like a dismal shadow. Had Tokyo's neighbourhoods become such dreadful places that it was only here, on this artificial land, that these children could act out their fantasies?" And as he wanders away from the zine fair, he ends up at a fence overlooking the Tokyo skyline and its proliferating massive skyscrapers. As he stands and watches, the landscape begins to transmutate, with the sky shifting from yellow to red and then to a dark purple. Quote, "The shadows of the crowded clutter of the buildings grew darker, and a desolate, ominous aura crept over all that Shozo could see before him. The ragged, blood-red clouds, driven by an untold wind, were scattering in sundry directions, and with ever-changing shapes across the sky. It was as if across the entire western horizon, tongues of fire, fanned by that wind, were flickering behind the vast array of buildings." So Shozo immediately brings to mind the horizon of the end of the war, a horizon that's both recalled in a social sense and imagined in an individual one. I'm just giving you a kind of sense of some of the other kinds of ways in which post-war cultural kind of producers are imagining these kinds of scenes. And here's an extension of that quote. "So it had really burned, thought Shozo. It had been in the spring, about now, just before the end of the war. Massive air raids night after night. Had he been standing here then, he would have been engulfed in an inferno, emanating not only from the west, but also from the north and south. Every night it had been a virtual circle of fire, a fire that surely must have reached as far as the water's edge, set the sky ablaze, and illuminated the sea." Yet of that, Shozo had no personal memory of his own. And so in his imagination, he instead saw flames pouring out of every window, a Tokyo Tower collapsing and burning rubble, and all the countless new high-rises glowing and twisting. The fire was raging all around him. And this description is akin to the way that manga artist Tezuka Osamu, who I talked about in the beginning with the Phoenix kind of manga, describes his survival of the fire bombings of Osaka in the waning months of the Second World War. He said, as the air raid warning siren began, I saw a formation of US bombers heading towards us. As soon as I thought, here they come, incendiary bombs showered down one after another. And just when I thought that would be the end of my life, a bomb hit the roof just 2 meters directly above me. Later I heard that this bomb directly below me. Later I heard this bomb killed all the people who'd rushed into the air raid shelter. I tumbled down the watchtower, screaming. All around me the ground was a sea of fire, and houses in every direction were burning with leaping flames. Etc., etc. So, over the course of Hino's novel, Sakai visits a range of waterfront wastelands like the ones in that previous scene. And at the tail end, he reflects on the relationship between the contemporary urban landscape, historical processes of ruination, and how time and history function together, when he's viewing the skyscrapers of the city from one such wasteland. He says, we built them in the midst of burnt-out ruins. The memory of the refuse he had seen on the outer portion flashed across his mind. The rows of office buildings that have arisen by sucking and swallowing energy from the surrounding earth are becoming an immense cycling system, ceaselessly devouring dreams, disgorging waste, and bringing forth new land. If the forgotten fortress in the forest, which is something he encounters, is a ghostly spectre that at any moment may vanish, the white high-rises are rows of luminous shadows. When one day the vital energy of both ancient nature and today's city ebbs, there will be born on this artificial land, still desolate and half-formed, a new sylvan city, a buoyantly breathing, inorganic forest inhabited by mannequins brought back to life. So as mentioned above, and I'm kind of coming to a conclusion here of sorts, Hino describes this relationship between past and present as akin to a Mobius strip. A Mobius strip is a curious object. If one was to draw a straight line from a single starting point on one side of the strip, by the time you complete your loop, the line would be on the reverse side of the object. You continue in the same direction, and you revert to your origin point again. Front becomes back, and then front again. And undoubtedly, in the intertwining of place and person, and past and present, Hino's deployment of this metaphor is useful, but it's perhaps inadequate to describe fully how these intertwinings take place, or to give a complete picture of how he thinks about the relationship between past, present, and future in the city. I guess this mnemonic historical element of his work is central in how Hino imagines the city of Tokyo itself as constructed, as a place that emerges in cycles of creation and destruction, akin perhaps to the phoenix with which I opened the paper. So he says, I watched this process of pre-war Tokyo disappearing and a new Tokyo appearing in its place. This was not a building up of an existing city, but instead happened on the terrain of the burnt-out ruins of war. That had happened before in the same way, so we have to accept that one day it will happen again. I began to think of a city as something that's created and propagated, and then as a living organism spreads wider, more complex, more beautiful. Like an organism, however, it will one day die, and then perhaps be reborn. I think it might be tempting to read Hino's text as a simple critique of linear post-war narratives of progress through an embrace of a more spiritualistic notion of cyclical time. But when we read his text alongside other writings, I think the picture becomes more complicated. It's certainly not a simplistic idea that history moves ever forward, but neither is it a perfectly cyclical process. The past is never perfectly reproduced in Hino's present, but returns in a changed form. What Hino presents here is a more complex understanding of how people relate to the evolving landscape of Tokyo. He calls them Mobius strips, and suggests that they represent contiguity between place and person, the constant evolution of landscape and our relationship to it, and an unsettling coexistence of linear and non-linear narratives of past, present, and future. But these Mobius strips are like Hino's Tokyo itself in a state of decay, leaving us with uneven snatches of the past to cling on to, partly recalled and largely imagined. We can see here the tension between the linear narratives of post-war progress, the desire for eternal life, if you like, in Tezuka's Firebird, and the imperfect cycles of reincarnation of the phoenix-like city in ruins. The unevenness of history, like the ruin itself, I think can result in several outcomes. Complete obliteration, a halting of decay in an ossified form, or as I suspect Hino and Tezuka, and perhaps Benjamin, wanted us to think of the past as the necessary toolkit for continued process of reimagining new and renewed futures. Thanks. And apologies again for all the...